All right.
Yeah.
Welcome to
Okay.
the
So
All right, welcome to the podcast of history. This is years 1885 to 1914, specifically in European history.
these years are very interesting. So World War One was obviously a world-changing event, like basically both in Europe and around the world. But the years leading up to it are often neglected, but they're actually very important to kind of learn the kind of context that this was going on. First of all, you had alliances being made between the different powers, like before World War One, like you had the Triple Entente and like the other stuff like that, that would ultimately be the powers that became the war. You also had a lot of technological changes. You had the invention of the airplane, even though that wouldn't be heavily used in Europe until World War One, kind of forced it to be. You had things like the telegraph and the telephone that became very prominent, so communication could happen a lot faster. You also had a bunch of political changes and wars, social changes also. The probably biggest social change in that period would have been the women's suffrage movement, even though it would take a long time to get the vote, specifically in the UK and Germany. It would take a long time for them to actually get the vote after that, usually by the 1920s. It would be there in most of them, but it happened. So basically, it had to do with kind of a little bit more of the progressive attitude that was prevalent at the time of the 1880s and 1890s. You had figures in Britain like Emmeline Pankhurst, who was kind of considered definitely at the time one of the more radical kind of, advocates for women's suffrage. I mean, she was like considered very kind of bombastic. We'd go into like public events and like kind of, try to get them to take attention to her. But unlike other social movements that the government considered a threat and tried to kind of suppress, really, the women's suffrage movement, a lot of the times they just saw it as kind of like an annoyance and a joke, kind of, and didn't really take it seriously. So one of the things that they did was women's suffrage people actually carried out bombings, especially in Britain, on not to kill anyone, but on property to show that they were serious. And that sort of backfired on them a little bit. That then people just became less apt to do that. But ultimately, I mean, with more democratization and liberalization after World War One, that would eventually become basically just something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Also, there was a women's suffrage movement in Germany. That was probably, despite probably one of the second most advanced country in Europe at the time, and that was there too. It didn't have so much attention to it as the one in the UK, but it was definitely very notable at the time.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting movements during this period for sure. I mean, we have obviously Marxist Leninism, and that's going on with
the second the International system.
Yeah,
it's gaining more prominence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and isn't it also true that a lot of the Red Cross and medical corps started internationalizing at this point also?
But yeah, definitely. This was kind of at least before the League of Nations, probably the biggest period of internationalization, kind of.
Oh, for sure, yeah, and not to mention, infrastructure to support internationalization was also going on, like shipbuilding, railway construction, it was happening all over the globe, pretty much. But especially in Europe,
pretty much everywhere became industrialized.
Exactly, but especially in Europe. I mean, Europe was sort of the main area, is the epicenter of it for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the areas that wasn't as heavily industrialized or modernized was the Balkans, though, and that kind of played into an important role, as that was controlled by the Ottomans, who were kind of seen as basically they were beyond the sick man at Europe at the time. They were just kind of considered an afterthought. They were so weak. And the Balkans, specifically seeing what happened in the Greek areas before, they had huge revolts against the Ottomans. Ultimately, in 1913, they would gain independence, but a lot of them. But before that, they were heavily bloody thing. The Ottomans were actually a little bit more prepared this time because they knew about what happened with the Greeks, so they kind of brutally put them down. I mean, they were still pretty, they were pretty brutal people even at the time when they were so weak. But they had the Balkan League that the countries actually formed together to kind of, that was kind of a little bit leading up to a sense of Balkan nationality, but
Yeah.
mostly as an alliance to again go against the Ottomans.
And wasn't there also a strong tie now with Pan-Slavism, like connections to Russia?
Yeah, definitely. You saw a lot of nationalistic and ethnic ideas coming along on this one. This period.
I was astounded to learn recently that Albania, obviously, it's a Balkan country, but they have a different culture. Albania didn't have railroads until after World War I. It was the only country, I think, that didn't have a railroad in its borders until after World War I.
Yeah, because the Ottomans at the time, in 1908, they had what was called the Young Turk Revolution, which was basically people attempting to modernize the country because they know it was so far behind the rest of Europe. I mean, ultimately, it would still get kind of destroyed in World War I, but that's later. But they did try, they did try to get more modernized by that period.
Well, and the thing with the Ottomans is the Ottoman Empire was already modernizing itself. It had some issues, though. It was very agrarian, very uneducated in terms of the provinces and so on. Maybe too much land for it to handle. A lot of wars with Europe and a rivalry with Russia, right? And then when it came to World War I, they chose the wrong alliance. They chose to ally with Germany, and they ended up losing. And you have to ask yourself the question, like, maybe they would have become more modern more quickly had they not allied with the Central Powers.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't known that Germany would lose the war at that time. Remember, they were considered a very modern and powerful country, so it's not like you can blame them.
No, I mean, and the Ottoman Empire was nothing to sneer at militarily either, but it was just it just didn't work out.
Well, yeah, definitely. But the UK, this was kind of considered like the latest period of the kind of imperial era. I mean, I guess like the 20th century it went into, but you consider a lot like these countries, they would bring back like sort of specimens from other countries and then kind of showcase them in their country and show their greatness, like basically that we've conquered all these areas. That gets into the World Fair kind of era.
The World's Fair.
About that sort of
they had those, quite a bit of those. Yeah. And they would change locations each time they did it. And around this time, they also, they had all these advances in flying too, the
Wright brothers were the first, but it didn't come into much use until World War I.
Yeah, and there was several French people that were really active in developing aircraft, and there's a couple British people as well who are famous in doing it.
Also, like very early cars
in the 1800s. Yeah, very early cars, but even going back to the 1800s, you had people developing planes that didn't have a motor but could still sort of hover for a while, almost like a hang glider or something. And then, I mean, flying as a definition wasn't really invented by the Wright brothers. It was invented more by the people that came up with the hot air balloon. But the what's interesting is at this period is all the innovation that's going on with electricity, which is just astounding. And you have obviously you have Alexander Graham Bell, who's Scottish, but he moved to United States. But you have people, Tesla was he was from Serbia. He was a member of the aristocracy there. And then you had plenty of other people that Marconi, was an Italian guy who invented the radio. Plenty of amazing electrical engineers, really. And plenty of inventions like the telephone, eventually telegraph. Before that, that was, if you wanted to be an electrical engineer, this is the period to do it.
Well, yeah, I mean that first that kind of made their connections to the United States more stronger with Europe because they laid out telegraph lines
transatlantic
across the Atlantic. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And that's that actually kind of was kind of the first step to America becoming a world power, being connected to Europe, and ultimately would surpass them.
And another thing that really helped with
Europe was still solidly dominant at this point.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, very much the predominant colonial power worldwide. Yeah, we're the European countries. But what's interesting is that in terms of uniting the Europe with America and so on, you had a lot of art movements that were kind of mattered on both continents. Like Impressionism is kind of the main one, whereas you had in America you had John Singer Sargent, who is the famous Impressionist painter. But in Europe, that's where they founded the movement, right, with Claude Monet. And then you go on to, post-Impressionism with Vincent van Gogh. But at this period, you had not only Impressionism in painting specifically, but you had Impressionism in music too. It was changing. It was becoming a media kind of enterprise. And you had Claude Debussy is probably the most exemplar of the Impressionist composers. But you also have Maurice Ravel and Eric Satie, among others. It's really quite a charming moment in the Parisian Belle Epoque that was kind of coming to a close by the time of World War I.
Yeah, you also had the development of photography had been first developed in 1830s, but first it became more prominent especially among upper class people to have their pictures taken at this time.
Yeah,
and eventually early film would be developed.
Yeah, photography coincided in many ways with advertising, as did sort of the Art Nouveau techniques of Alphonse Mucha or the famous Tiffany, who did who has a department stores now. But Tiffany was originally known for sort of small pieces that decorated the house, famous lampshades and so on. Very very arts and craftsy. Very they called it Art Nouveau because it was the new art, but now it seems pretty old. And that was really associated with sort of competing with photography, and it's it's brutal realism, whereas Art Nouveau tried to have a more a softer interpretation of visual life.
You also saw very early film at that time.
Yeah, but film wasn't used as so much in advertising, but it was an outgrowth of photography for sure. And I believe the first day, I don't know if the Lumiere brothers were active at this period, but they were certainly alive. And I think that they did exactly. This period was the high point.
France was kind of a pioneer in that.
Yeah, it was, Thomas Edison is the famous one in America, but we forget that the Lumiere brothers were kind of invented the projector and popularized it. The first people in the world to popularize projection cinematically.
Yeah, they had that famous film, The Trip to the Moon, which was kind of one of the first what you call feature films, meant to be shown to audiences.
That I don't think that's the Lumiere brothers.
Yeah, I think that is the Lumiere brothers.
No, that's
Méliès.
Yeah,
Méliès.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was all based off of Jules Verne, and we're seeing this in this period right now.
Sci-fi writers.
Famous sci-fi writers. He was active a little bit earlier, maybe a decade or so, but then he was sort of
one of the first sci-fi writers.
One of the first popular sci-fi writers, probably the first popular sci-fi writer. Just someone who only wrote science fiction and made his living just writing science fiction. It's probably Jules Verne, but he wrote in French, and eventually, he'd get kind of eclipsed after he died by H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells is one of the big in this Edwardian England period. H.G. Wells was a mammoth of a writer. Of course, alongside him, you also have some very famous Catholic sort of writers like G.K. Chesterton is Hilaire Belloc is another one. Very kind of conservative by modern standards, but at the time they were sort of seen as middle of the road. And it just goes on. I mean,
Oscar Wilde, definitely.
Oscar Wilde, yeah, of course.
I mean, he was extremely controversial at the time. He broke a lot of taboos,
And he died really young. Yes,
playwright. Yeah, he died pretty young.
Mm-hmm. I think this is also the person who's my favorite at this period is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Sherlock Holmes. I think that's kind of the main guy for me in this period in terms of writing. But a lot of people have different opinions all over.
Well, he was more writing for popular audiences, so sort of
Yeah, but that but you still got still great stuff.
It had the famous Penny Dreadfuls. I don't think Sherlock Holmes was one of those, but they were kind of cheap, sort of tales that be sold to modern audiences.
Eventually, that would be called pulp fiction, but at the time they could just call it Penny Dreadful. Yeah.
But there was also changes in that this was around the time the kind of pioneers in psychology came about, particularly Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung as figures.
Yeah, and they had there's an interesting situation with them because they They, Freud's obviously the most famous one, but there's also, and he was, a Moravian Jew who moved to Vienna and worked there as a biologist. He spoke like 10 different languages, including Greek and Latin. He was a very intelligent guy, always thinking, always going to frequenting the coffee shops in Vienna. He actually went to the same coffee shops as Lenin and Hitler and like these like big like people who become world famous. He was literally in the same coffee shops as these people at the same time. And but eventually he wasn't going to become a dictator. He was going to become a psychologist. And the psychology at this time was something that was very much a sort of like an allied science of biology. It was you ran tests, you proved things with data charts and evidence, and it wasn't something that was very like considered to be reliable in terms of speculation, like theorizing about it on and endlessly like philosophy. But Freud was so good at it with his therapy techniques that he kind of just like revamped the entire field and made like therapy kind of a thing overnight. Well, not overnight, but he made it in a matter of a decade or so. He made therapy like a viable thing. And there is something to be said about drawing from the tradition of a Jesuit confession, like Catholic confessional. That is sort of like the precursor to therapy. But it wasn't secularized until Freud. And the thing about Freud is that he was respected amongst his colleagues. People think of him now as this sort of out there guy, like he was like almost like déclassé or maybe a little bit debunked.
Well, he wasn't eccentric on really any sort of level. He just kind of talked about things that were taboo, or they're kind of weird at the time.
It was weird in a way, but he was respected by his peers. And the most famous peer that we could mention is also a protege of his was Carl Jung. But then he's
actually
Alfred
Adler. Psychologists considered even greater than Sigmund.
Yeah, he's far more popular now in the psychology community than Freud is. But you have the other people who were psychoanalysts who were students of Freud. And my favorite is Adler. But you also have Erikson and Hannah Arendt, and who's actually has a cool distinction of being not only
she's a little bit later though.
Well, no, she wasn't that much later. Her distinction is that she was a psychologist as well, a psychoanalyst, right? Psychodynamic, as well as a philosopher in the Frankfurt School, which is a very like a prestigious philosophy school that was emerging at this time. And
the Frankfurt School is later. That was I think Frankfurt was a center of kind of the specific Frankfurt School of Marxism is kind of later, but the Frankfurt area was a place where a lot of philosophers came from.
I was just talking about the famous psychoanalysts. I wasn't so obviously Hannah Arendt, was like younger than Freud, but
much younger.
But in that camp of psychoanalysts, in Vienna, right, you also had, and eventually Freud goes to London at some point, but in that camp, you also have a parallel group, which is the Vienna Circle of Mathematicians. And they had a famous meeting in the year 1900 where they were trying to talk about all these different problems in logic that are outstanding, and no one really knew how to reckon with them. And, you get people like Rudolf Carnap, Karl Popper, Ludwig Wittgenstein, A.J. Ayer, like these people who met in Vienna and eventually be called the Vienna Circle. But at the time, there was no name for it in 1900. It was just where the mathematicians would meet and talk about the outstanding problems in logical mathematics.
And the Vienna Circle is kind of later, but...
No, it's the Vienna Circle, the name is later, but it started in 1900.
Well, yeah, and a lot of this, a lot of this kind of stuff happened, like particularly involving kind of psychology was kind of coinciding with the decline of religion. Particularly, like a lot of people assumed, especially, with the human mind, that you were created by God and everything is because of that. And then with secularization, kind of tried to put a more scientific understanding of the human mind, which made a lot of these psychologists more popular, even though, as some like Freud don't really hold water today.
Yeah, well, his theories, I feel like I have to defend him slightly because the way he wrote was a very organic, classically trained kind of metaphor using florid writing style. It wasn't something that was like meant to be scientific and medicalized the way that we are so rigorous about now. Back then, like writing about psychology was such a new thing that there wasn't really like an established way to do it that was considered politically correct or more rational or more sensible. He was kind of writing in a more a loose kind of way. So when you have to take what he says with a grain of salt to some extent because of how florid it is.
Okay, and speaking of religious issues, there was this is kind of a time period. A lot of people, when you talk about the Holocaust and what led up to it, you can trace a lot of that back to this period. And the first event was actually not in Germany. It was in France. It was something called the Dreyfus Affair, which there was an officer in the French army. I think his last name was Dreyfus. I remember his first name. But he was basically accused of treason, like giving, secrets about the French intelligence to the Germans, I think. And this had a huge controversy in France. Like you could basically, people in France either, kind of lined up against him or for him, and there were Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards, basically, and a lot of it had to do with the issues of anti-Semitism. Basically, because he was Jewish.
Do you know why this was happening? Do you know why this is happening?
What are you talking about, the affair?
So with the Dreyfus Affair, the reason it was happening was they were starting to allow Jewish people to take on roles in the government while being, and this was like a radical reform that allowed it was pro-secularization, and it was such a hard thing for the French government to sort of do that there ended up being this backlash, which was that the Dreyfus Affair, right? And they accused Alfred Dreyfus of being a treasonous, even though there wasn't good evidence for it. And
it was kind of like think about how Rittenhouse would divide people into two camps based on their political ideology today. It's basically the same thing with Dreyfus. It divided the nation. People were either for or against him, and him.
And it also showed how anti-Semitic France was. I mean, it really kind of highlighted it.
And this kind of leads into the birth of the Zionist movement. You had people prominent figures there, like Theodore Herzl, basically saying that a lot of this, and they were sort of proven right by the Holocaust at the end, that Europe was not going to be safe for Jews, and they promoted a movement to move Jewish people from what was then Europe into what was Ottoman Palestine, considered then. It would later be British Palestine after World War I. But then, and the Zionist movement was originally a secular movement. It was not a religious thing. It basically said that they need to do this for practicality, just because they wouldn't be safe in Europe. And that did get some success earlier. Basically, a lot of Jews did move to that era, kind of found their own institutions. Tel Aviv was founded on what was originally basically just a sand dune. That would come into a lot of conflict later, but that was kind of the birth of that kind of movement.
Sounds almost like Las Vegas.
Yeah, basically.
I don't want to backtrack, but I just want to defend the Freudian camp one more time. I think that if you look at the followers of Freud, like Melanie Klein or Erich Fromm or Erik Erikson or Adler or Jung, you're going to find that those people have there's more of a medical outlook that they have that's more sane and sober than what Sigmund Freud actually wrote. So there is some sort of they bring the reason back into it a little bit, and they changed the nature of the psychoanalysis for the better, I thought.
Yeah, psychology would eventually become much more professionalized.
Yeah.
Especially in the early 20th century. But this time there was a lot of political shifts. Basically, there were some wars. There were around the turn of the 20th century, the two biggest wars involving European powers would probably be the Second Boer War in South Africa between with the British, and the Spanish-American War involving, Spanish and America. I'll let you get into the Spanish-American War.
The Spanish-American War is fascinating as an American because you have all these still, in the 1820s, Latin America by and large rebels against Spain, no longer dependent on Spain as a subjugated, nations or whatever. But then you still have Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam, a lot of like places in like the world that are still Spanish, run by the crown. And for whatever reason, the Americans under McKinley decided these people, need to be liberated, basically.
Well, yeah, they used the thing about the USS Maine bombing, which most people say is trumped up nowadays.
Yeah,
there's a false flag.
There's a false flag element, but there's also this element where they're like, oh, these guys are having all these rebellions. Let's go in and like support the rebels, and then we'll, steal the government from the Spanish. And it was like this. It was like
that's what Theodore Roosevelt in prominence.
Yeah, he was an active combatant in the Spanish-American War. Yeah, and Rough Riders. Yeah, he was one of the leaders, I think, of the Rough Riders. But obviously the Spanish-American War ended up turning into other things like the Philippine-American War, and it ended up sort of like it was bad for Spain, but it didn't really matter for the rest of Europe.
Well, Spain those were kind of like Cuba was one of the last vestiges of their empire.
Yeah, the last vestiges. Yeah, it was really winding down at that point.
Yeah, and there's also the Boer War, which was in South Africa, and the British, it was between British and there were a group of people, they were Dutch settlers. They'd actually been there since the 1600s, for a long time by then. They were nicknamed Boers, and the British, under people like Cecil Rhodes, wanted to kind of extend their influence further into South Africa, and they eventually came into conflict with these people, and there ended up being a war. It's actually a very brutal war. I mean, it would kind of give a lot of preview into like the kind of brutality modern warfare would take in that period. But,
and this was there a lot of African support? Like, was it similar to the Zulu War, or is it mostly like white people against other?
No,
white
the Zulu
people?
War was earlier.
I know, but was it similar?
The Zulu was kind of been subjugated by then.
So, but was it? What I'm saying is, was it African against white, or is it white against white?
No. It was white against white. It was Dutch settlers who were called the Boers against the British.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That's interesting about that is that you have England and the Netherlands, which are so close. It's like you could like literally swim from one to the other, but they're not at war. They're only at war at these faraway colonies in South Africa.
Well, yeah, they were pretty. They were pretty disconnected from the Netherlands government by then. They were just of Dutch descent. But it was kind of like the Boers they were outnumbered and outgunned by the British, so they used guerrilla tactics like ambushes, like blowing things up and stuff like that. And the British kind of responded in a really brutal way, basically taking entire like groups of people in towns and putting them. That's where the term concentration camp was actually developed. But they had this like scorched earth, like absolutist policy to defeat them. But ultimately, the British did end up winning. But they did lose a little bit of kind of their standing on the world stage because of just how brutal they were. Like that was actually one of the wars that was first heavily reported on by foreign reporters, and that ended up kind of damaging their reputation. There's also the Germans in Namibia. They were really brutal to the locals there when they occupied that, and there had been a lot of combination there. That was kind of the period when people started questioning the morality of imperialism.
I heard that the Germans, they went in and they literally would just shoot people, like massacre people with machine guns. And it doesn't sound like much of a surprise, but the interesting thing was that the machine gun had like recently been invented, and immediately they go down to Namibia, right, and they just shoot people. It's like barbaric.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like that's a period. Imperialism was still heavily in place, but it was kind of like a period when people would kind of see it for what it is more often. Like the stuff would happen. Like they didn't. Most people in Spain, like when Spain conquered America, didn't know what the hell was going on there. Like they wouldn't know. But here, like people would start actually hearing news reports about it, and that would kind of a little bit undermine its support.
Yeah, the Boer War is similar to the Crimean War in a way, and it's like obscure, but it actually had a lot of innovations were going on.
Well, yeah, there was also a lot of events going on in Eastern Europe, but primarily involving Russia.
Yeah, well, did you want to talk about the Russo-Japanese War?
Yeah.
Can I preface this by saying that before this happened, there was something called the Sino-Japanese War, and that was sort of part of a sequence of events of China sort of being weakened by foreign powers, which obviously started with the Opium Wars, and then eventually the Japanese started attacking China too, in northern China, and then eventually the Russians want to fight the Japanese.
Okay, so Russia they had long held Siberia, but they didn't really develop it a lot. So what prompted the Russo-Japanese War? Japan had recently emerged from like a long exile and decided to kind of mimic European-style government and like especially in their military institutions. But still, even then, a lot of Europeans didn't like take them seriously or see them as an equal even closely. But what happened with the Russo-Japanese War is the Russians, which were a European power, solidly one, they wanted to expand into like the kind of what would be seen as the eastern coast of Russia, was so like around eastern Siberia, into those places like Vladivostok and other places, and that the Japanese saw that as kind of interfering on their influence, what they wanted to be into it, and ended up leading to a war. And what happened was amazingly, the Japanese won, and the Russians were forced to kind of retreat or like kind of make a peace treaty, and like but that was considered like extremely like event because like East Asian power that beat basically most Europeans knew nothing about beat one of their powers, and that was considered unprecedented. It kind of showed that Europe was no longer the only game in town. And secondary to that, the treaty that ended the war was the Treaty of Portsmouth, named after Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The United States brokered it, so that showed the United States was also becoming a big, player on the world stage.
Yeah. What was the war that Theodore Roosevelt signed the treaty for? Like the
Russo-Japanese War.
That was yeah. Theodore Roosevelt. I think he got a Nobel Prize for that.
Yeah. Also, this is kind of I actually have a great grandfather who fought in the Russo-Japanese War on the Russian side.
Wow.
So other than that, yeah. But also, what happened in Russia immediately after that was also very notable. What you had is the Tsar had kind of like portrayed himself as this like even if people didn't like him, as this kind of unstoppable power within Russia that you dare not revolt against. And the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War wasn't the cause of like what's going to be called the 1905 revolution, but it kind of played a role in showing that that Russian government wasn't all that powerful and could be revolted against. Internally, politics in Russia, what happened is there was a lot of kind of agitation around this period in 1905, and there was like worker strikes and stuff like that. It was kind of intermittent with the kind of rising socialist movement that in Russia, like the kind of
there's a lot of unionizing. Sorry, there's a lot of unionizing at this period as well, right?
Yeah, and they weren't really recognized in Russia though, but like because they said that's actually one of the reasons they became so powerful. Ironically, is because when you try to suppress something too much, it gains more sort of appeal. So earlier they had the assassination of Alexander III by I forget what the group is called. Let me look it up for a sec. He was assassinated by.
This was quite a bit earlier, right? This was in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was assassinated by basically a leftist group. That was I actually So what happened was there was an event called Bloody Sunday, which they was getting outside one of the state buildings in Russia, and the troops opened fire on them.
When was this? Because this isn't Alexander III.
1905.
This is 1905. And isn't it also true that after Alexander III was murdered, the Tsarist regime became very cloistered and protective of the Tsar and kind of kept him, like away from the people. Like
but this ultimately
security was
conflagration, which was a massive violence between the government and.
What I'm saying is that you have one of the reasons why the people don't like the Tsar is because he's always hiding and stuff, and there's a Rasputin characters are showing up, and he's trying
like other examples, like Queen Victoria made herself like very known publicly, basically.
Yeah, when she was popular. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
so basically you had a huge outburst of violence in this period, and ultimately the government won. They suppressed the revolt. They realized that they couldn't hold it any longer, so they made some, like I guess, small sort of conciliations to the people what they're demanding. The biggest one was the formation of what's called the Duma, or the Legislature of Russia, which would basically the first time Russia would at least nominally be,
and that didn't last.
Have some democratic elements.
That didn't last very long. Yeah, the Duma.
Yeah, but it was ultimately like the real power was in the Tsar. The Duma was kind of really just not really. It was just like a fake kind of institution, really. Because the Tsar held all the real power. He was the one who could call the Duma into session. Other than that,
I mean, like the people, Nicholas II was just very unpopular, and his family was so. It's unfortunate they were all murdered eventually, but it was they were so unpopular, like the Rasputin character was just like this crazy guy, and it was all because he had this hemophiliac son, right? Who was, I guess, the heir to the
and the group that assassinated Alexander II was called the People's Will. One of my
no, I'm talking about Nicholas II. I'm talking about Nicholas II.
Yeah, my great-great-grandfather. I talked about one great-great-grandfather that fought in the Russo-Japanese War. My great-great-grandfather on the other side actually was killed in the 1905 revolution. He was a member of the Popular Will, which is kind of like one of the sort of proto-Bolshevik revolutionaries, though. So, one of my grandfather was a avid Tsarist, and the other one was a revolutionary.
Yeah, your family's like really Russian, right? Is it Russian on both sides?
No, only one side, but that's not like getting into it. But other than that, so that kind of showed Russia, even Russia to some degree couldn't kind of resist the tide of liberalization, even though they'd long been absolutist power. Like the Duma didn't have any real power, though. Like it was just kind of like a sham, like institution, like I said. I mean, ultimately that would lead to what the Russian Revolution in 1917. But
and what I'm getting at is that, and I understand all this. And the thing is that I always find fascinating is that the character Rasputin, because he was it was very bizarre for someone as powerful as the Tsar to invite someone like that.
He was like most of them considered like kind of like a scam artist, but I guess the Tsar fell for him. Though.
But he was bad public relations for the Tsar, right? Because in the Tsarina and the family.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like they saw you as being controlled by these crazies.
And when they were, when there was this revolution of 1905, this was like worldwide news. Like this was like a travesty for like European like prestige, kind of, that this would even happen.
Well, the 1905 revolution wasn't successful, but it kind of it's necessary if you're going to understand the later.
No, but it was a nightmare, for the aristocracy, just the prestige of the global aristocracy. It was a nightmare.
Yeah, but like Rasputin as a deal, he was hated by both the ardent Tsarists and the revolutionaries. He was like kind of hated by everyone but the Tsar himself.
Yeah, Rasputin was just generally disliked. They couldn't even kill the guy, right? They tried to murder him. And
that's kind of later in that. He was trying to kill by the loyal Tsarists who kind of blamed him for the uprising that was destroying the Tsar.
Do you know when Rasputin was killed?
He was killed, I believe, in 1916, right before the revolution.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
That's kind of later.
Well, on a lighter note,
so I actually guess
let's talk about someone who is very positive and very cool and no controversy at all. Albert Einstein.
Definitely.
1905.
This would be early Einstein at this point.
Yeah, early Einstein, but some of his best work, nonetheless. And when he really started to become like a famous, physicist, his special year, the Annus Mirabilis, which was they call it that because Einstein had not Einstein, Isaac Newton had one in 1666, and as a physicist or whatever, and then Einstein had his own a miracle year. Annus Mirabilis is what it means, and in 1905, and he came up with a lot of works on optics and theoretical physics and stuff. But and he actually, when he got his Nobel Prize, he wasn't given his Nobel Prize for his theory of relativity. He was giving it for his work in 1905. Even though it was considered minor by, in terms of his whole career. But yeah, so I just thought that would, lighten the mood after talking about all the bloodbaths.
Yeah, well, we're going to get into the lead up to World War I now. So between this time, there were a lot of alliances that were made. Probably one of the most significant ones was the Entente between France and Britain and also Russia, but France and Britain had been enemies for like so long that it was kind of like a surprise that they would come together. Just kind of, this was before World War I, but they knew they had to make some sort of strategic alliance because of Germany. France hated Germany, and Britain kind of feared them too, kind of in going towards their influence.
Yeah, it is my understanding that the Germans thought the British would actually help them. The Germans were a little bit surprised that the British allied with the French, or were leaning.
And this kind of. Okay, so and the Austrian Empire is still around though. They're just very weak compared to the Germans. The Germans were their main allies, the ones kind of backing them up.
It wasn't even the Austrian Empire. It was the It had been reformulated as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yeah. And Hungary was the reason for that, by the way, was because Hungary didn't want to be part of the empire anymore, of the Austrian Empire. And so Franz Joseph was like, okay, I will like be the emperor of Austria and I'll be the emperor of Hungary. And he did it to like placate the Hungarians. And that's the only reason they didn't fall apart completely.
Yeah, so another thing is, like I said earlier, the Balkan states won their independence from the Ottomans, and one of the newest states that was formed was Serbia. And Serbia is probably the closest, to what the Austro-Hungarian terrains were. I think the Austro-Hungarians still controlled what was considered Bosnia then.
Well, actually, Serbia. Okay, a point about Serbia. People think like Serbia was like this long-standing part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that like finally was like fed up with the Austro-Hungarian like regime or whatever the emperor. But the reality is that Serbia was like a newcomer to like Austrian Empire. Like it was always like it was a lot more often part of the Ottoman Empire than the Austrian Empire in terms of border stuff, gerrymandering and whatnot. And Serbia wasn't like this like mainstay of the Austrian Empire that like decided it had enough. It was always kind of on the fence about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, kind of like the Austrians extended their rule over Bosnia, and the Serbians basically feared that they would start extending to them. And there were Serbs in Bosnia, and there were Serbs in like Serbia, because Bosnia is a very multi-ethnic, sort of society. So, but Germany also basically was allied with Austria. Italy was actually allied with it didn't really play a huge role in World War I, but it's actually allied with what we can consider the Allies, the Entente, Triple Entente. But basically, so Archduke Franz Ferdinand, he was in Sarajevo. A lot of people there was really no reason to be in Sarajevo as the emperor. So a lot of people thought this was a provocation, over Serbia and a lot of people. And there was a young revolutionary called Gavrilo Principe, who ended up shooting him, and that drove into a diplomatic crisis with Austria, basically, kind of like Austria.
No, because he was the heir to the emperor, right? But he wasn't actually the son of Franz Joseph. Franz Joseph's real heir, like the original heir, he like killed himself and wrote a letter to Franz Joseph saying, "Oh, like I will never like be your fucking heir. Fuck you." And then he writes this letter and then kills himself. So Franz Joseph is in this really fucked up position where he has to make Archduke Ferdinand, who's like a nephew of him, he has to make his nephew his heir, and he doesn't even really like the guy that much, and so he's like not a popular figure for that reason. Is that Franz Ferdinand was not popular because he was sort of like this eccentric huntsman guy. He wasn't really like what the common people thought the heir would be.
Okay, but after that, Austria was not going to actually invade Serbia. But what they demanded to do, because they thought this was a conspiracy, like there had been more players like in his assassination, so they demanded that the Austrians be given control over basically Serbia's police force to investigate. And Serbia didn't want to do that. They thought it would be ruining their autonomy, like destroying their national pride. And Austria then didn't invade actually right then. What happened was they actually went to Germany first, and the Germans say, "Oh, should I do this or not?" Because Germany was kind of their main backer. They wouldn't do anything without their here to say. And Germany said what was called kind of the blank check. They said basically, do what you want, and we'll back you up. Yeah, and this was kind of the spark that ended up leading to World War II. But World War II had been World War I. World War I had been kind of building for a long time, though. These alliances and these kind of arms race almost.
It's funny about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand is that he was kind of doing a publicity stunt, right, by going there and showboating and whatnot, and Sarajevo. But then the Black Hand organized to murder him, and the guy who tried to kill him blundered, and I forget what he exactly did. I think he threw a grenade, and it injured the driver slightly, just like a tiny bit, and the driver drove of the car that Franz Ferdinand was in. He drove down a different street trying to get away, and then Gavrilo Princip had like given up on trying to kill Franz Ferdinand. He was literally in like a restaurant eating a sandwich, and then he looks out the window and he sees Franz Ferdinand driving by. He's like, "Oh, okay, I guess I still have a chance." And he walks out. And he just shoots him like extemporaneously.
And the reason they went to the Germans, the Germans, in any rational world, the Germans would say, no, this is going to, this might start an international war, and, basically just don't do this. But you had Wilhelm II, who was the Kaiser. And Wilhelm II, he was a very interesting person. Kind of, a lot of people considered him sort of, not really all there mentally. He was kind of a little bit crazy. But he wanted to expand Germany's power, and he said, maybe this can do something. If we start a war, we can beat them, and then we'll be the main player on the European stage. So he knew this would lead to a war. He actually, that's one of the reasons he did this, and so that's where World War I starts.
Yeah, there's this idea back then that we don't think about a lot, but there was a Germanic idealism, where the Germans and the Austrians thought, because we all speak German, that they should group together no matter what. That's not really how people think anymore. But back then, that nationalism was really an undercurrent of, political theory and strategy.
Yeah, and France had been hungry for revenge against Germany for the Franco-Prussian War. So
if France would have fought Germany over a loaf of bread at this point, and then I think, they were so bitter about that. And then obviously the Russians backed Serbia. I'm surprised the Russians.
It's of Slavism, like Pan-Slavism.
Yeah, but I'm surprised that to me seems excessive. To back a small country like Serbia, and it started in a giant war. I mean, to be fair, the Germans won the Eastern Front war against the Russians, but they lost against the Entente on the West.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that I think we got most of the stuff we wanted to talk about through. So
yeah, I think so.
Next podcast we'll be talking about World War I and its aftermath. This is kind of the biggest, sort of war since the Napoleonic era, definitely in Europe. I mean, but that kind of wraps up the event we're talking about from 1884 to 1914.
What did you think about Italy during World War I? Were you key? Because I always thought that what they were doing was pretty interesting.
They weren't a huge player in World War I. They did actually back the Entente against Germany, though.
Yeah, but you know what it is that they it's just they had this unit called the Arditi, which was a mountain special forces unit, and I don't know. It's just Italy is an interesting country because in World War I they compared to World War II, the Italians were like a lot more competent. So they had every country had different fire weapons. Obviously, in World War I, you see tanks and stuff. But going into the war, every country had researched different kinds of rifles, and Germans had the Gewehrs, and the Austrians had Steyr was a major company. But then in Italy, you had something called the Carcano, and it's an interesting gun for many reasons. One of the reasons it's the gun that ended up killing JFK by Lee Harvey Oswald. It's a rifle, the bolt action. But the other thing is that it was like a surprisingly good weapon for when it was a surprisingly good weapon for the Italians to be using that they had invented with their own factories and ingenuity. And I just think there's a contrast between the Italians in World War I and the Italians in World War II. When we talk about World War II, we're going to talk about how there is quite a bit of the discrepancies between the competency of these different countries in the First World War and the Second World War. Yeah, quite a bit. All right, well, I guess we'll wrap it up and we'll have a good session next time.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yeah, are you there?